There is one less front to worry about. Israel and Lebanon agree on a ceasefire. We will talk to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the man behind Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon 25 years ago. The Israeli government targets the Israeli media, and it's Thanksgiving. Israeli woman and English man here want to take part in American traditions. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy, 2 Jews on the news. I do not have a turkey in front of me. I'm not one of the... I mean, there are people now who do this, who actually sort of vicariously get into a kind of Thanksgiving thing. I heard people, in London yesterday talking about it as if it's a British holiday. I mean, this is only at the margins, I promise you. It hasn't come here. Halloween has completely come here. It's wiped away. Guy Fawkes night on November the 5th, that used to be the thing. Now it's Halloween. I'm drawing the line here. I mean, I can't really think we should be doing Thanksgiving, but a lot of our listeners will be giving thanks. We have the greater part, I think, of our audience is in the United States, and we say happy holidays to them.
Oh, indeed. I mean, it would be an interesting twist, ironic twist of history if England took on celebrating Thanksgiving for sure. There's obviously a large part, a very large population of Americans who made Aliyah to Israel. So it's a thing here as well. I wasn't invited to any Thanksgiving this year, but generally I'm occasionally invited. I didn't want it to turn into this sad story. But yeah, it is a thing here completely. And you think about the fact that our American friends are celebrating Thanksgiving after an election, which means families getting together. And it's not when you think of the Jewish experience, the Israeli experience, is families come together every Shabbat. This is American families come together. It's more of a rarity, about 3 times a year maybe, and it's Thanksgiving, so they do. But they might argue about politics and might argue about Israel. We're sorry about that. We apologize beforehand. But let's talk about just a minute about the spirit of the holiday. Can I be a Hallmark card for a moment and talk about...
I'm still reeling from this news that you weren't invited. I think the Americans in Israel...
I should never throw out that stuff at you. I knew you'd pick that up.
No, obviously I'm going to pick that up. But I know that the American expat community in Israel is now already jostling to make sure they get an invitation in.
It's too late. It's too late.
Yeah, no, the hurt's already gone deep. So go on, yes, be the Hallmark greeting card.
Yes, and just to say thank you, because, this has been such the darkest of years, and even in these dark hours, we kind of need to think about what are we thankful for. So I guess I will say for friends, new friends that I made this year, and for this experience of ours, this podcast, and for our listeners. We think a lot about, we hear from listeners, and we're very grateful to hear that we are a lifeline for them. We should tell them that they're also for us, because this project is something that I think occasionally made us feel better this year. So those are my thank yous.
That's very good and very big-spirited. I'm still on, and I was about to make a snark remark about... So true. No, about this thing of the rarity of getting together. There's all these movies and everything, Home for the Holidays. It's such a big thing. And we'll go over this again as Chrismukkah approaches, because it's, again, one of those years. We had one not that long ago when... Christmas and Hanukkah combined, this time even more, because it's actually they begin at the same point. December the 25th, I think, is the first day of Hanukkah, first night. So, but it's always that thing. That's one of those moments of great Jewish disconnect. It's one of the things actually diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews have in common. They all get together often, Friday night, basically weekly. And I think all, whether Jews are Israeli or diaspora Jews, they all find a slight kind of quizzical incomprehension other people who think it's a massive deal to have dinner with your family, because we do this quite often, i.e. weekly, rather than it being a big annual traumatic event worthy of a Hollywood feature film each time it happens. But no, that was my low-minded thought. My high-minded thought is absolutely, it's a good idea once a year to be thankful. And as you said, especially when we might not be feeling that thankful, it's good to sort of focus the mind. And I like your notion of this podcast being something that has brought, lots of people together. It's brought you and me together. We wouldn't have known each other the way we know each other now otherwise. So all good. We give lots and lots of thanks. And in fact, not a bad week to be doing it, because there will be some people, and we'll come on to this because it's obviously not everyone, but there will be some people in Israel who are very thankful for the deal that was finally struck this week which brings some quiet. Officially, it's a ceasefire deal. It's not, it's not a peace treaty. To the north of the country, this has been the big second front in the war of the last year, flared up in a massive way in recent weeks and months between Israel and Lebanon.
Yes, entirely. Look, again, this is one front that we can now put aside and not worry about, at least not as dramatically as we have. This war started on October 8th with Hizbollah firing anti-tank missiles against the Israeli military base on Mount Dov, and ever since has been bombarding Israel, particularly the north, but not only. Obviously, this took a major shift or major pivot mid-September when Israel took out. Remember that description that Shimrit Meir gave us. If it was a company, then took out mid-management with the pager operation, and then targeted killings against the sort of top brass of Hizbollah, culminating in the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, massively weakening the organization, of course, its stockpile of ammunition, bringing this finally to a deal in which Hizbollah had to give up its main demand. Because I remind you that the main thing that Hizbollah did was to link the north and to link Gaza and say, we will not have a ceasefire in the north until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. So basically giving up that, agreeing to be pushed north and not to threaten the Israeli towns and townships on the northern border. I remind you that everything that's been found there in the sense of tunnels and ammunition just proves what Hezbollah was actually planning, which was obviously a larger massacre than what Hamas perpetrated on October 7th. So all this is in the agreement. And Israel, of course, it's an interesting thing. As you said, a lot of Israelis are thankful of the fact that this will mean that the war in Lebanon, the war between Israel and Hezbollah, is over. But there is a feeling like, wait a minute, shouldn't we have gone after Hezbollah in a way that would eliminate it completely? That wasn't in the goals of the war, but when the government and the prime minister are promising this kind of victory, there are a lot of Israelis kind of feeling, wait a minute, that is not what has happened here. Hezbollah still exists in Lebanon.
Yeah. I mean, I think the number one goal of the war, but certainly in the public mind, was the notion of those 60, 65, 70,000 people being able to return to their homes in the north of the country with complete peace of mind. And that is the thing I think people feel has not been fully achieved. They cannot feel 100% certain that they can live there on the border with Lebanon, with the certainty of knowledge that Hezbollah rockets and fire isn't going to resume. And so that's where the sort of tension point is. I mean, you mentioned about details in the deal, and there's certainly been a lot of reporting. It's worth noting that the deal itself has not been published. You cannot look at the specific term as you would in a regular sort of treaty or armistice agreement. Instead, that's not been published, nor has there been published what we know exists, which is this side letter between Washington and the government of Israel, in which, and this often happens with agreements like this, when one party is reluctant, the kind of bigger patron or backer or broker reassures that side and says, look, even if the other, the third party don't help, we'll have, we've got your back and we will do X, Y, and Z if this in any way comes apart. A lot of speculation about what might be in that, what kind of guarantees Washington will have given. Useful light was shed on that with an interview you yourself did, Yonit, with the man at the centre of all this, as your guest on Channel 12 News. Well, why don't you say who you spoke to?
Yeah, so it's obviously the man of the hour, Amos Hochstein, who is a top advisor to President Biden, also the man who brokered this ceasefire deal, has been the person behind the mediating efforts for more than a year. And I think it would be useful to run a little bit of that interview. It illustrates what is different in this deal compared to the UN Resolution 1701 that ended the Second Lebanon War. And it also, I think, illustrates some of the Israeli criticism against the deal, or at the very least, the questions that Israelis have after the ceasefire was decided upon. Let's go into the weeds of the deal itself. The main question for many Israelis is enforcement. We see Hezbollah already trying its luck by the border today. What is better about this agreement than the one that ended the Second Lebanon War, Resolution 1701, which was never implemented properly? How can we be sure this time it's going to work?
Well, I've been openly critical of Resolution 1701 in 2006 because I thought it was very nice words, but there was nothing that was set in place to enforce it, frankly, on either side. Neither party enforced it or lived by it. Hezbollah obviously did much more than Israel did, but nobody really put any effort into it. So we were determined to be able to bring a change in that and created a mechanism here that will be chaired by the United States together with France and others, and bring in other allies who will support the LAF. But the mechanism there will be not the UNIFIL will be taking the complaints of violation and reviewing them. They'll be part of it, but that the U.S. will have, one, ability to share information quite immediately between a suspected violation on either side with the other party, being able to work with the LAF and the Lebanese army and other security services in Lebanon to investigate it, monitor it, dismantle it if necessary, discontinue it. And those are all things that we're now putting together literally in these hours and days to put this effort together. And we're not going to stop. It's not a temporary effort. It's a sort of enduring mechanism that will look at these violations and address them immediately.
Let's talk about the opposition to the deal. People like former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's saying there's no demilitarized zone. The villages on the border can be rebuilt. The stockpile of weapons, however decreased by Israeli actions, is still there. Essentially, the claim is this. Isn't this a missed opportunity to weaken Hizbollah so thoroughly to the extent that it would loosen its grip on Lebanon and no longer pose a serious threat to Israel?
So a couple of answers. One, Hezbollah is weakened. It is degraded. And at some point, you have to say, okay, what's the point of degrading it? At some point, you have to get to a deal itself. That's number one. Number two, yes, there are fantasy deals that are utopia, where you get a ceasefire agreement with a security zone, etc. But those won't ever happen. There will never be an agreement that also has Israel as a occupying force in another country. That country will not sign that deal. So if you have to choose. And if you choose to have a dead zone or a demilitarized zone, then you are there as an occupier and you are not there in agreement, which means that while you may have 2-3 kilometers inside Lebanon, or maybe even 4 or 5, there's no agreement to stop shooting at Israel from longer ranges. As every Israeli today knows, it's no longer just about 5 or 10 kilometer ranges. It's about much further. So it's much more important to get an arrangement where we can enforce Hezbollah not being able to return to the south, not being able to rebuild its terrorist and infrastructure, which is in the agreement, and have an agreement to stop firing rockets and UAVs and rebuilding its arsenal against Israel. From the sidelines to say you could have had a better deal that gets all these fantasy elements to it is nothing more than just that, fantasy.
Netanyahu's office briefed reporters that the administration threatened Israel that it won't use its UN veto if a deal isn't signed. Do you have a response to that claim?
I don't know who said that, but and I confirmed this with the Prime Minister's office. They claim they did not say this. There was no such discussion at any point. It never came up.
I want to ask about France. The French wanted to be part of the agreement. Israel was reluctant at first because of what it sees as France's problematic attitude towards Israel. May I ask you whether Israel agreed to have France as part of this agreement in return for saying it will not cooperate with the ICC warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu?
I really can't get into any diplomatic discussions that may or may not have taken place between Israel and Paris. You'd have to ask the French or ask the Israeli government on that. France has a traditionally very strong and important role in Lebanon. And so I think that it's very important to have them. Again, the U.S. will chair the mechanism, but having France there, I think, supports and helps for a better implementation of the agreement.
Reports said that you told both sides it's now or never. Is that accurate?
No, I never say now or never. I did say that there was a window of opportunity to do this now, and either we did it, and I thought that all the conditions were there, and then if they did not want to do it now, then they would have to wait for a new president to come in, which probably meant March or April, as a new administration doesn't do things right away, and that could come at an opportunity loss. So there was a moment of opportunity here. And look, at the end of the day, you have to translate gains on the battlefield into an agreement, because otherwise you just keep fighting. And at some point that becomes of diminishing returns.
Can you tell us if President-elect Trump or his staff were in any way involved in forging this deal?
I informed the Trump team, the President-elect Trump's team, his national security senior advisors, and made sure that they were aware of what the tenets of the deal, because it's very important for them to understand and support it, because they're going to have to carry it forward and implement it as they take office in just a few weeks.
So a really, I think, very clarifying exchange between you and him. As always with these things, what they say, also what they don't quite say, was all very, very interesting. There had been reports, and I think in the conversation you got into them with him about, was there some kind of deal with the French in which the French agreed to hold off on enforcing the ICC arrest warrant on Netanyahu were he to come into French territory, and France, their part of the thing was to say, we won't necessarily arrest you if you come. That could have been part of it. And then also just the notion that in the lead up to this, there was some arm twisting going on from Washington. It's since been denied, but it's been reported that, that Washington was saying, if you don't sign on the dotted line here, then we don't always have to veto, as it were, anti-Israel resolutions when they come to the UN Security Council. I mean, he said to you, that's not how it was. I don't recognize that description exactly, but nevertheless, those reports are out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say here. First of all, Netanyahu is in a bit of a fix because he promised, and particularly his base, he's been talking a lot about total victory, particularly in Gaza, but there are a lot of people in the Israeli right, and you look at polls coming out this week, general public, 37% say they're for the deal, 32% oppose. Out of Netanyahu's own base, 45% are against the deal. So he needs to explain this to the Israeli public, and I would say that whoever did brief Israeli journalists on the fact that the Biden administration threatened Israel to go for this deal wanted to use that as a bit of an explanation, right? There are other explanations that Netanyahu put out. He said officially we need to refresh the troops, we need to focus on Iran, we need to isolate Hamas, but he really needs to explain to his base why this is a deal. I would say that the why now question is interesting. Part of the answer has to do with the Trump effect. First of all, Donald Trump said he wanted the war to end. And Amos Hochstein said this in the interview as well. If you're waiting for the Trump administration, it's going to take months for them to actually, enter the White House, understand what to do, and then go to a deal. So there's a lot going on here. One more note I would say about the residents. You mentioned incorrectly that the residents of the north, 65,000 who were evacuated, are not coming back. That's because the government didn't officially tell them they can come back. What the government is saying officially is that this is a ceasefire, not that the war is over. This is also part of Netanyahu trying to explain this to his base. And there has been devastation and houses and infrastructure that need to be fixed, and the education system, the schooling that needs to get back. This might take months until Israelis are able to actually come back home to the north. This has been 14 months in which 65,000 Israelis haven't been living or studying or working in their actual homes.
Yeah, wonders how many weeks he's got left to play this game in the Netanyahu circle of saying, it's not me, a big boy made me do it, which is the line again and again. And they're still getting, juice out of that lemon. They're still able to say, oh, don't blame me, blame the Americans. It's amazing to me how the base do still buy that, but you can see why they do it.
And more, if you're saying, essentially, and this is what he said to the Israeli public this week, if we need to, we will return to Lebanon, then that begs the question more and more, why can't you do the same thing in Gaza? The reason, or part of the reason, is that his coalition didn't threaten to fall apart, to vote against when it came to the Lebanon deal, but his coalition is threatening him if he does end the war in Gaza. So that's part of the story. But again, it just sort of brings to the foreground that question. If you can end a Lebanon war and promise Israelis that if terror ensues again, you will resume fighting again, why can't you make that same claim when it comes to Gaza?
I mean, not for me to defend Netanyahu at all, but it takes two to tango. And as I understand it, the difference in this case was that, via intermediaries, but Hizbollah was ready to sign a deal even without that guarantee that Israel wouldn't come back in, that there was no permanent end. And as what's always been said is in the Hamas-Israel talks, Hamas will not abide by any agreement that allows Israel that free hand, and that has been a difference on the other side. Hezbollah were in a real corner. They had been massively depleted by Israel's military successes these last 2-3 months in particular, the pager attacks onwards, as you mentioned. but also they are under other pressures on the ground, sort of locally, as it were, within Lebanon. There are other forces in Lebanon, other players who were sick to the back teeth of being caught in the crossfire in Israel's battle with Hizbollah, and there is just not an analogue to that. In the Gaza situation, Hamas are not under that pressure to do a deal that would allow Israel freedom of maneuver in the way that it seems, because again, not been published, but seems to be part of the terms of this agreement.
We should also mention that the biggest difference and the biggest tragedy is the fact that Sinwar, in his terrible thinking, also abducted Israelis. There are still 101 hostages held. And that, of course, shifts the way you can run this war in Gaza. This does not exist, thankfully, did not exist in the Hizbollah story. Not because Hezbollah wasn't planning it, because it didn't implement the plan.
The emotional temperature of this front has been just completely different from the Southern Front from the very beginning, for exactly the reason you've said. For one thing, it's ongoing. The pain of the hostages. For another, the atrocity of October the 7th is what puts the Southern Front in a completely different sort of emotional sphere, and that's always been the case. And so this was always the easier deal to do. And I think the American administration would be the first to, Amos Hochstein indeed, would be the first to say that this was just a less intractable problem from the outset. We will talk about all of this and much more, obviously, with our very special guest, the former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who knows from Lebanon, from his own time in office. So we'll get into all of that. Obviously, this is the news of the week, this deal, but this was also a week marking events a year ago. In fact, it was that period where we were in the studio together doing Unholy that week as the final pieces were being put together in what we thought was the first, what we hoped would be the first of several hostage release deals, but in the end turned out to be basically the one and only.
First of all, it is unbelievable how time can be the shortest thing in the world. I can't believe it's been a year. I mean, when the hostages came back and we saw the pictures this week, because this is what television news does, it brings you back the images of a year ago. And we were sitting in the studio, I remember this, and we all had tears in our eyes of joy to see the hostages coming back. It was 8 days in November and December. And as you said, we really thought that this would continue. And it's been a year. We've talked a lot on this podcast. Israeli media is, talking a lot about missed opportunities. The fact is that there are still 101 hostages there. There have been reports coming out this week about top officials in the Israeli government briefing Trump's team, saying the hostages, there aren't many of them alive, or at least giving the impression that most of them aren't alive. We should stress that the information, according to the information held by intelligence officials in Israel and by the defense echelon, about half of them are alive. And winter is coming, and the time to do this is now. It's beyond the time to bring them back. Every day that we sit here, every hour that passes is endangering them all.
Yeah, I think what would have shocked you and me, who were side by side a year ago, was the idea that we would be talking about this a year later. The frame that we were all in then was in terms of weeks and months. I mean, I remember my own reaction in the autumn of being sort of depressed and dispirited and horrified when you and others were saying, look, I think this is going to go on into January, into 2024. What? How? This is impossible. How could that possibly be the case? And here we are talking about 2025. And when you say winter is coming, it will be a second winter for those hostages. It's unspeakable that this has gone on so long. And it just, we have made this point before, but it's worth stressing that this is an upending of what was just a basic sort of fundamental truth about Israel. No one would ever be left behind, that it was unconscionable to do that. And that's why the country went to this enormous length for the release of Gilad Shalit and one soldier. The whole country was on the edge of its seat for 5 years in that case and would not rest until he was back. And it was a consensus, pretty much, that he had to come back. And now it's this divisive, polarized issue. And this is the bit that astonishes me. I just cannot quite still get my head around the fact that when hostage families speak, there are people in Israel ready to shout them down. And that somehow it's kind of part of the culture war that if you're very sympathetic to the hostages, then in some people's view, that makes you a sort of dangerous leftist. You're against Netanyahu if you just are wearing the yellow ribbon and want the hostages home. I mean, jaw-dropping still, to me. In my mind, it's baffling that it isn't the first, foremost, sine qua non thing, and then everything else comes second. But it isn't, and that's the reality we're now in. One of the great pleasures of being out and about doing various sort of events, as I've been doing recently, is encountering unholy listeners. And I have noticed there is this sort of desire, there's a kind of pecking order, because people come to me now and say, I've been listening to you, ever since October the 7th. And then someone else will go, I was listening to you before October the 7th. I was listening to you during the judicial coup. And it's like a sort of veteran, and that happened this week as if to prove what long-time listener this person was. They said they were listening. What had drawn them in was the judicial coup of the summer of 2023. Nothing past tense about that. It has come right back into the news.
Oh, yes. This coalition, a little bit like Bruce Willis and Die Hard 3, came back with a vengeance into its winter session with the judicial coup. Whether it be, that feeling like Netanyahu fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and nothing happened, so he is now unbound and can do whatever he wants. Maybe it's the feeling like Trump is near the White House, and again, he will allow Netanyahu to do whatever he wants. He most certainly won't be reprimanded for any judicial coup bills like he was during the Biden administration. So yes, a lot of this legislation is coming back. Some of it has to do with the weakening of the Attorney General, several of the Attorney Generals of different ministries. Some of it had to do with weakening the Bar Association and delaying appointing of judges. But I would want to focus on something perhaps we haven't talked about enough on the podcast, and that is the part of the judicial coup, or the curtailing of is not only the curtailing of the judiciary, but also the curtailing of the media. And I would want, obviously, I have skin in the game here. I'm not an objective observer, but I would want to sort of tell our listeners a little bit about what the government is planning in relation to that. So first of all, we should start with the bill to privatize the public broadcaster Kan. It is Channel 11 in Israel that passed in a preliminary hearing. Privatizing the public broadcaster means essentially closing the public broadcaster. I should note that the two main commercial channels, which is my network, Channel 12 and Channel 13, published a joint statement saying this is a media coup under the cover of the war. The other thing that has been talked about now is the closing or privatization of Galei Tzahal, the Israeli Army radio, another important part, my alma mater, if you will, important part of Israeli public broadcasting. And the ratings bill, which means that if it passes, also passed a preliminary reading, means that it allows the Minister of Communications to assume control of the independent organization that measures ratings. Ratings means advertising, so you understand what this means is to curtail the funding going into commercial channels. And finally, and this has also happened very recently, the boycott of Haaretz, the government announcing on Sunday that it's severing ties, advertising ties, mainly with the newspaper. The official reason was Amos Hochstein, the publisher of Haaretz, in his comments referring to Palestinian terrorists as freedom fighters. He walked that back, saying this is all part of the same picture. It is the government trying to curtail the power of any media outlet that they cannot control, essentially.
Just to clarify for people who might not be across all this, why is it that privatizing a broadcaster either means that broadcaster disappears or means its political independence is compromised? Is the assumption that if these channels do go private, they will immediately go the way of, for example, Channel 14, which is the kind of pro-Bibi network? Explain to us why private, what the politics of privatization is.
Well, essentially, I think the importance of a public-funded media outlet in a democracy can't be overstated. If it's just the market, and this is a commercial television gal here talking, if it's just the market, then you might not get the high quality product that you can, because there's money, the drama is expensive and documentaries are expensive, and you can try and do that in a commercial channel, but it's very, very difficult. So if you're taking a public broadcaster like Kan, which is the reincarnation of the first channel ever to air in Israel, and you're saying essentially we're selling it to whoever buys it. So first of all, you're on the risk that maybe no one buys it. And after 2 years, it will actually just dismantle. And if you do sell it to someone, it's a private channel, then it no longer has the characteristics of a public broadcaster. And that, I think, is a danger. And again, it's all a question of motivation. If your motivation is to say, oh, we want, pluralism and as many channels as you want, of course, in a country of 10 million people, that's one thing. But that is, we should say gently, you can suspect if that is indeed the motivation.
Yeah, no, the larger point I was going to make is when we were talking initially about the judicial coup, then and where does this sit in relation to that? It sits right alongside it, because if you look at those places that have gone through these experiences, and when we were in that period of 2023, there were people trading tips and information from Hungary and Poland saying this is the process. It is always the judiciary that is a target and the media. They run alongside each other because they are independent centres of power, and they are checks and balances, restraints on the executive. That's why Viktor Orban didn't want an independent judiciary that could, hold him back. Didn't want a media to hold him to account. And so these two things are two sides of one coin. They are absolutely the same phenomenon. So, of course, that if this coalition is limbering up for a fight again with the judiciary, of course it would have the media in its sights. No surprise, the targeting of Haaretz. The form is both a boycotting in terms of the government advertising, job opportunities and so on, that kind of advertising, but also subscription. So now, if you're a civil servant in a government department who used to, as a matter of being informed, get several Israeli newspapers delivered, you cannot now order Haaretz to be one of those papers. That motion has been passed unanimously in cabinet. Aleph Ben, the editor of Haaretz, wrote this week, actually in The Guardian, saying that if then legally that move was struck down, Netanyahu won't object. He'll say it's the legal deep state holding him back. And that's how you see these things. It's all one circle. The law, the media, it all combines and plays to that narrative, which, as I say, is from a playbook some of us have seen quite close to home here in Europe. It's very familiar to people in Poland or Hungary. And I think, as you said before, whereas Joe Biden and Tony Blinken express their unease at these changes, now I suspect if this happens and goes ahead, Donald Trump will be asking for tips. He
promised something similar, didn't he? About news outlets that don't agree with him. So.
He did, and he's put someone in charge of the FCC, and Brendan Carr, who has written of this exact agenda, where you would start threatening broadcasters' licenses and so on. So, Donald Trump would stand back, applaud, and take notes rather than criticize.
Yeah, but look, you mentioned the judicial coup began or entered our lives on January 4th, 2023. That was when Yariv Levin, Minister of Justice, newly appointed at the time, set out his whole plan. And that created huge unrest in Israel and protests and a whole, almost a year until October 7th hit us. What is happening here is a much more sophisticated version of that. These are, I would call them smaller bills. They're introduced, intermediately. And when you say something like the ratings bill, it sounds innocuous, right? Well, it's just that the Minister of Communications will be in charge of the ratings measurement. Okay, but that means that at the end of that stands the fact that if you have a commercial channel, you are going to get paid much less in advertising because the Minister of Communications says, oh, you know what? It looks like the channel that is the mouthpiece for the government, Channel 14, actually has 3 times the ratings that Channel 12 has, which of course the reality is the opposite. But that is, again, so it's done in these sort of innocuous beats instead of being a huge declared revolution. And I think that is what they learned. That's what the coalition learned after January of 2023.
Yeah, and learned as well from those experiences of those other places, because there too, it was death by 1,000 cuts. It was always gradual. We wanted to turn to assess all the big events that have been going on this week, but really in a way where Israel stands now. So many dramatic developments, whether it is the International Criminal Court, whether it is the year-long mark being passed in the war against Hamas. And who better to turn to than someone who has been in that seat and who has made these decisions. It's a very small club, but our guest this week is a member of it.
Ehud Barak was Israel's 10th prime minister, also its defense minister, chief of staff, and its most decorated soldier. He was present at most, if not all, of Israel's critical moments of decision over the last several decades. He is the man to turn to when you want to go beyond the immediate news of the hour and see a larger picture. And we are so glad to have him on Unholy today. Thank you for being on Unholy, Ehud.
Thank you for having me.
You know, obviously the top of the news of the hour is obviously the deal in Lebanon. You were the prime minister who ordered the withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 1999, and you know the region very well. Since then, Israel has been twice in Lebanon, boots on the ground, 2006, and this year, 2024. I guess my first question is just to ask you, how optimistic are you that the ceasefire will hold, that this front is one less front to worry about?
The agreement is basically quite good, say reasonable under the circumstances. Question whether it will stay. It depends on both sides and on the patrons. And the main edge of original 1701 that shaped the landscape since 2006 is the fact that the United States, France, and the UK are involved in the kind of overseeing team. They can make it work. They are strong enough, self-confident enough. Now, how will it work? That's not clear, you know. If you listen to the Israeli news, it seems that we are entering into a period of continuous attrition. Few villagers who belonged to Hizbollah in the past are entering, we attack. We hear that some mortar shells were brought into certain village, we attack, and so on. This won't work. It won't serve Israel. In fact, it served the Iranian original idea of having this long attrition war on as many fronts as they can. So I think that it will work differently. A violation is observed, and attention of the patrons, the committee led by American CENTCOM general, is drawn to it. A warning issued to the Lebanese army. Probably we do not respond on the very first one. It starts to accumulate with several of them. Then a formal warning comes to the Lebanese government through both Israel and the kind of overseeing committee. And only then, after you basically made it clear that there is a mutually agreed violation, then we act. That might give it certain kind of chance of working for the better for both sides.
The long-term goal of this war, but I think of other people, would be that the people of the north of Israel can return to their homes and live with peace of mind. And to have true peace of mind, you have to think this isn't just going to hold for a few months or even actually for a few years. You'd want to know that it is dealt with and that we're not going to be back here again. What is the answer to this long term? There's this deal for now. But what is the way to get peace on that northern front so that we're not talking about every few years another round?
First of all, don't be sure in the Middle East you won't see another round and another round.
That's right.
But having said this, in order to secure the people who became refugees within Israel, some 60 or 70,000 of them from the north, you have to reach their trust, to have their trust that you are serious, that we are serious. I think that keeping the agreement the way that I've described give it certain chance. But of course, there will be a need to make sure that there is no any direct fire from light weapons and not even from these high precision anti-tank missiles that can destroy a house sometimes, which could be launched even from 3 miles, about 3 miles. So this area should be clean from weapons, and that should be imposed by the whole agreement. Of course, you cannot secure perfectly against long-range rockets that can go over the whole region and hit Tel Aviv, so it can for sure hit the north. But I think that most important for the people is the fact that there is no direct line fire, accurate one, into their homes, and they should not be worried about attack of the type that happened in October 7 in the south. That will need the IDF to deploy force within each and every settlement. Some of them are few yards from the from the border. And it will take time. It will create a heavy burden. We will need more units. That's another issue in Israel, how to share the burden over the whole population in a more equal way. But that's the way. I think that because they were rooted out of their settlement very violently by the government, probably not fully justified at the first 24 hours, there is a need to compensate them generously, the government should take commitment to rebuild everything that was destroyed. That's not responsibility of those citizens. Even to give them certain tax preferences. We know how to do it, we can do it, but you should do it. And it stops. Quite disturbing. The government seems to ignore it, not to notice it, neither in the north, nor in the south. Probably about 20% of the people who live there, mainly young people, or those which they're residential, mainly residential, or probably whatever they have, the business they have, they're totally destroyed, that might consider not to come back, and that's part of the price of such a war.
I want to zoom out for a minute because Hezbollah is ultimately the proxy. But let's talk about the real problem, which is Iran. And you know, famously, I'm reminding our listeners who might not remember this, you were famously in the Netanyahu government between 2009 and 2013. You were defense minister. You wanted then to attack Iran's nuclear site. That didn't happen. And today you call it pretty clearly a de facto a threshold nuclear state. Now, this year proved that Israel can attack Iran directly. It sadly also proved that the opposite is true. Iran can attack us directly. When you look at that, which is probably the biggest danger we're facing, what should be done? Is this the moment to try and, do that plan that you wanted to implement in 2009, 2010?
You cannot recreate the situation. The difference between now and then was that in 2009 to 2012, the project, the Iranian nuclear project was still young and unripe. So by a surgical operation of one night, probably a night and a half, we could basically delay them by several years. Even when we attacked the Osirak reactor near Baghdad some 40 years ago, and when we attacked later on, a generation later, the Syrian attack, we could not seriously say that we delayed it by more than 3 years. Because they can call the French or the North Korean companies who built it respectively, and give them premium for the risk of another 30%, and they ask them to build a new one. But there is a fear of repetition of the attack. There are other issues that sit on the shoulder. It ended to be forever. So I thought I was probably the most hawkish among us, together with Lieberman. Netanyahu, to an extent, was with us. But we failed to convince even the inner cabinet, the inner cabinet, the gang of eight ministers that was the core of any cabinet. We couldn't, for different reasons, we did not succeed. Now it's a different story. When Netanyahu convinced Trump, when he was president, to leave in 2018, to leave the agreement, the Iranians were held about 18 months far from turning into de facto nuclear threshold. Now they are probably 18 days. Some commentators professional, call Netanyahu the father of the Iranian bomb because of his success to convince Trump to leave it and open the door for the Iranians to move forward. And whenever there was complaint against, say, who the hell broke the agreement? It's America, it's not us. So they are now 18 days, probably minus 18, probably they are already there. So it doesn't mean that they have a weapon immediately. Probably it will take another year and a half. But the real meaning of being a threshold nuclear country is that there is no single surgical attack to be attempted by Israel or even by America, which will delay them by, let's say, 3 or 4 years. It's impossible. They have too much sites, too well protected, too much already quite highly enriched uranium, and the step from the 60% to 90+%, which is the weapon grade, is very short, very fast can be happen. In case of Israel doing it alone, it could even become a justification and legitimization for Iran to break out, because they will argue the Americans listed out their nuclear dog, namely Israel, who did not even sign the NPT, and we have a nuclear plan for peace, and we now have no way but to develop a weapon. So it's not easy to execute, and it's not clear. Of course, we can reach any point if Iran. Even during the recent attack on Iran, Israel attacked certain site called Fortune that some Israelis hint that we caused a major damage. You know, an Israeli attack on the nuclear sites of Iran is symbolically important. There are certain symbolic elements. We are at the core of their objectives, probably, and we did our part. But strategically, it's almost negligible, because you can show in a satellite photos the damage that you caused, but it won't delay them more than 2 months or a few weeks. Even the Fortune site that was attacked, you can see the hits, but you know, it was a site of nuclear activity more than a decade ago. And the IAEA found there certain micro amounts of highly enriched uranium and so on. And even if you hit there, it will not block them. They have this equipment, whatever is needed in order to build a weapon in several other places already now. So this is sensitive. And of course, it cannot be done. Even we contemplate it, and clearly there, and the symbolic aspect is not totally unimportant. But Netanyahu, I think, will think of it only in coordination with Trump. And Trump, I believe, have totally different perspective on it. He sees a global picture with a newly emerging axis of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, who rises against the other side, America, the EU, the NATO, similar kind of like-minded countries, few of them. And the real challenge is there are several wars. There is one in Ukraine, there is one in the Middle East, and there is simmering tension underneath the surface in Taiwan. I believe or suspect that Trump will look at the whole picture, will try to hit a deal with Putin on both Ukraine and simultaneously to put an end to this war.
If that's how it is going to play out with Trump, and I agree that's very plausible, should Israel just go with that in the sense that it can't beat Iran by military means for the reasons you've set out? That ship in a way has sailed. Should it try and get in ahead of some kind of grand bargain that Donald Trump may well be brokering? And if it does, what would that look like? Or is the alternative they just get left behind, Trump cooks up a deal with Putin in Iran, and Israel is left out in the cold?
Look at the war from bird's eye view. It always reminds me the three maxims set by Ben-Gurion, our founding father, for Israel to go into war. Make sure that you have a superpower on your side. Make sure that the war is aggressive, offensive, very short on the enemy's soil, in order to make sure that it's over when we still have international legitimacy and could release the reservists who will activate the economy once again. Number three, very important, before, during, and after the war, always have a firm grip on the moral high ground. Israel is strong, is stronger than any neighbor, but it's not alone in the world. And to ignore realities of the strategic landscape is very dangerous and very costly later on. So Israel cannot afford act against the will of Trump. It doesn't matter that when something comes, an existential threat is actually immediately over us, we are sovereign, we'll do it even against the will of the rest of the world. But that's not the case. That's not the case, in spite of what Israelis are hearing, especially every Holocaust Day, when they hear that we are on the verge of being exterminated by. Mm-hmm. It's not that simple. If you want, I will explain it, but it's up to you.
But I just want to understand, because if what we're saying is essentially that Israel will have to accept the fact that Iran will be a threshold nuclear state or eventually a nuclear state and not have much to do about that?
First of all, it might happen. You know, in the last 35 or 40 years, there were 6 attempts of second-grade countries to turn nuclear. 2 were blocked by external pressure. Gaddafi after Lockerbie, the South African during the change of regime. 2 were blocked by surgical Israeli attacks. Saddam Hussein in 1981, and a generation later, young Assad. And 2 defied the whole world and turned nuclear. It were North Korea and Pakistan. It's clear to me for many years now, from the previous decade, Iran is trying to step in the footsteps of North Korea. But think of this example. North Korea never thought of really drop a bomb on South Korea, on Japan, on the Americans and Guam. It was never on their mind. Not because they are not fanatics, because they are not stupid. They understand that it will cause bringing North Korea back to Stone Age. It is the real reason behind it is to reach deterrence. It's about the longevity of the Kim dynasty. It's not about attacking with nuclear bombs. And under this umbrella of having a nuclear capability, they might try to have more room to maneuver in the region around the Tonkin Gulf. Something similar happens with the Ayatollahs. They are fanatics, they are extremists, they want to see us disappear. They do not seriously consider dropping a bomb on Israel for the same reason. They fully understand they will end up bringing Iran to the Stone Age. And they are not stupid. It's not about this. It's about reaching a longevity for the Ayatollah's regime. They want to make sure that no one, including the Americans, will not intervene forcefully with military means inside their territory, because it never happened to a nation. So it's not a simple issue, but we have to take all the alternatives, do whatever we can to stop it. But do not see it, we are not having to pack all our things and go back to the Eastern Europe or to the Maghreb if a neighbor will become, against our will, a nuclear power in the next decade.
But I understand that all the arguments you've made, but it does sound like you are at least coming to terms with the idea that Iran will have a bomb, and you don't think, even though you said we've got to do all we can, just pressing on this, I'm not sure you've said that there is anything Israel can do to stop it.
No, we're dealing with realities, not with wishful thinking. At night, I dream of waking up with the same Israel we have in Scandinavia, probably. Or we have all the Scandinavia being brought around us. In reality, you have to judge realities, and you cannot ignore reality. The reason that our predecessors for more than 50 years now, preparing Israel in ways that the public in Israel doesn't know, but the Iranians, Americans, everyone else know very well, for the case that someone will turn nuclear, means that even the founding fathers thought very seriously when we develop our allegedly, we never admit having any nuclear capabilities, but if the founding father made it, they made simultaneously the effort to make sure that we will be ready. I don't recommend to be ready. I recommend to do whatever we can to try any crack, any dead, to topple. In fact, I didn't mention it. The only thing that could be done, because surgical attacks against the nuclear infrastructure cannot delay them for very long. The only option that remains is to topple down the regime by a kind of campaign like Clinton launched against Belgrade, against Serbia in the 90s. But in order to do this, you have to bomb Tehran for 70 kind of repeated days without leaving it. And that's something that I doubt whether any American president, including Trump, who is unpredictable, will be ready to do, especially now when Tehran is a major supplier of missiles and drones to Russia, and a major supplier of oil to China. And they are in a kind of axis. I suspect he will prefer to try to strike a deal, not at any price. Probably he will raise the sanction. Probably he will even try to reach another nuclear agreement. It seems to me more probable than supporting or backing a full-scale Israeli attack on the regime in order to topple it down. And you have to think of it. We are dependent in a way about the judgment of Trump. We can try to influence him, but he's genuinely unpredictable. I still remember, Yonit will tell you that 5 years ago, Netanyahu took a group of journalists on the airplane, flew to Washington, promising them along the way that next week we annex the West Bank by permission of Trump. He came back hugging the century plan of Trump, which is basically a two-state solution. So history has a lot of ironies, as Bibi is cursed by being hit by it once and again because he doesn't understand the dialectic nature of history. Only every action has a reaction before a synthesis emerges, and you have to take all this into account in advance.
Definitely Isaac Newton has to be taken into account. You're right about that. But let's talk about the unpredictability of Trump. Some of his appointments are, people who really support Israel. Some of his appointments are isolationists. Some of them are really inexperienced. Someone like Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, for example. First of all, how worried are you that this unpredictability, especially in relation to Israel? The MOU is up. Israel needs to have that support and military aid renewed. And where is this going? And also, do you think that Trump, I'm asking a pretty large question here, do you think that Trump can also say to Netanyahu, you have to end the war in Gaza? Is that one of the things that you think can happen?
I want to start with Biden. We have to be extremely thankful to Biden. I cannot remember a personally new all-American president since Ford, except for Trump. And I cannot think of anyone who helped Israel in a moment of crisis. So going to that extent, this kind of seriously with emotional energy, coming to Israel, hugging the families, talking to the public, and suppliers immediately. The airlift started before Bibi regained his balance to run the war. It was great, and we should be thankful to him. Now, I'm glad to say that I'm quite confident that Trump also is shown to be very positive towards Israel. But I don't think that we should take too seriously the nomination. He has an experience from his previous term. He got the conventional wisdom recommendation, take serious people. He took General Kelly. He took McMaster. He took the chairman of Action to be his state body. He took even Bolton, which is a little bit kind of a hyperactive guy, but he took serious people. And what happened now, all of them, one by one, is describing to the people that he doesn't fit to be a president of the United States. So he got a painful lesson. He now nominates only those who are loyal to him. But they are so loyal, and they were selected because they are so loyal that those who will pass the confirmation process will be loyal. It doesn't mean that he doesn't listen to them, but he can navigate them wherever he needs, especially after getting this kind of really extremely impressive mandate from the American people. It's something after the night where he was elected and Gallant was fired in Israel, I told myself I have to think for 2 weeks, not to raise any ideas, to think for 2 weeks, to understand it. It's something much more profound. We have to think very seriously what blocks the Democrats, how it came that now the Republicans represent the blue-collar people and all those who are frustrated, and the Democrats kind of represent the progressive and the woke and the rich people, and the California and New York is represented by the Democrats. So it needs a deep thought, but it gives unprecedented mandate to Trump, and he for sure will follow his instincts rather than recommendations of Huckabee or etc. or whatever. He will listen, but he will follow his instincts There is a lot of worry in Europe, other places, because there is understanding some of the policies that he announced will hit, first of all, the poor people of the world, later on weak countries. It will open for local powers and with isolationism. It will open opportunity to Russia, for that. Why just Ukraine? Why not Moldova? Why not the Baltic States? And China might find some good timing to do something similar in the arena. And even Iran will get encouragement. So it's very complicated, but he is confident, he's self-confident. He got a kind of tailwind from the American public that he will follow. And America, because of its natural powers, two oceans, Canada and Mexico, and the economy that can be self-sustained, they don't really need, if under pressure, they will be the last to feel even the consequences of high tariffs or war trade. America will be the last to suffer.
But Yoni mentioned, and I want to sort of bring us back to the war in the south, the war against Hamas in Gaza. Now that Gallant is gone, Trump is there, Netanyahu could feel unrestrained. He could do what he wants there. And I wonder what you think he might do there, whether he might actually go for something, a project which we know people in his coalition want, which is to settle in Gaza, to never leave. That's one option, one scenario rather. And then the other question is almost at the opposite end, which is what should he do? So I'm asking in a way what you think he will do now that he's free and what he should do in order to achieve those aims of destroying Hamas or defeating Hamas and bringing the hostages home. What should he do? You've been in that chair. What should he do?
I want to start with the grave mistake that you've done. This war, as I mentioned, the three maxims of Ben-Gurion, Netanyahu behaved as a national leader as if he trying to prove that there is other paradigm under which a war, successful war could be done. So the main weak point in his belief that he tried for whatever reason to bestow upon the whole public is that Hamas should be defeated, a total victory, by eliminating the last Hamas fighter, the last IED, the last RPG, the last launcher. That's nonsense. The only way to defeat Hamas, the only thing that frightens Hamas, is to be replaced by another power in Gaza. Israel has, the evening of the 7th of October last year, Israel had a compelling imperative to make sure Hamas will never ever reign politically over Gaza Strip, will never ever be able to threaten Israel. But the way to do it was to make as early as possible a situation when Hamas is removed from power and someone else, another entity will take over. And Biden proposed it from day one or from the third week. Even he was so frustrated, he published an article in Washington Post that which described, basically said the following: Israel is now here, you strike very heavily, so let us coordinate the following. We will update the other members of the peace agreement or the Abraham Accord, let's say the Egyptian, Emirates, the Jordanians. And they will establish a inter-Arab force backed by a majority resolution of the Arab League and backed by the United States, who will demand from Israel to stop fighting with no condition and go out of the Gaza. We'll say after 2 months or 6 weeks, which is about the time that was needed in reality to make sure that Hamas does not control anymore and to destroy most of its military capabilities. We will say we are ready to go back to the perimeter, be there, ready to re-enter if something gets wrong, but with one condition, that you will enter with your forces and make sure that Hamas cannot come. They will enter, as Biden proposed, for 9 months or 18 months, and Hamas will not raise the head against them because unlike Israel, where he can still shooting Israel even 2 years from now or 20 years from now, on the Egyptian, they cannot shoot because the Egyptians holding the oxygen pipe to the strip. And they cannot shoot at the Emiratis because they're holding the wallet to pay for the tens of billions for the reconstruction of Gaza. And there is a need to bring an entity. Biden followed the logic of the region. You cannot bring but an entity which is legitimate by the international law. legitimate by the neighbors in the region, legitimate by the international community, and legitimate by the Palestinians. And the only body, entity that answers these demands is the Palestinian Authority. Everyone knows that they are weak, they are short of perfect in many aspects, but they are much better than Hamas, no doubt about it. And this, Biden has proposed, we will bring a revived Palestinian Authority. You cannot bring 80,000 people to be from Ramallah to be the bureaucracy. You should basically build on the existing bureaucracy. You can make sure that no people who belong to the Hamas military arm will participate in this bureaucracy and stay with the Palestinian Authority until they become self-confident enough to control it. So that was the idea. That should have been done. It could, we could do it in the end of January. And after the 3 months, first 2 months of intensive fighting, Israel went muddling through, both in the south and the north, for 8 months until in September. It now, Netanyahu talks as if he initiated at the right timing to go to no, it was a technical problem with the pagers that imposed on Israel to start it. So, and we, in the last 3 months, we have huge achievements on both sides that restored the deterrence vis-a-vis enemies, restored the respect among neighbors, restored even the self-confidence of the public in the capacity of its arm, and even the self-confidence of the leaders of the intelligence and defense system. So it was ended up something which is explainable, but to say that that was the way to run the war is far from being true. Now, what has to be done now? We have to pray that Trump will demand that the hostages will be brought back home, and then Israel can end its project in Gaza. The only thing that we need, which is now more complicated, but originally the Egyptians and the Emiratis could present themselves as the ones who demand and enforce upon Israel to stop the war and going out. Now it seems more that they are going to save Israel from sinking in the mud, which is less popular among the public, but a way should be found the same way that was found in the south. There is no justification to do it, and many in Israel suspect very kind of disturbed that the real, genuine reason why it is stretched has nothing to do with security, nothing to do with real interest. It's all about the longevity of his coalition, and I should admit that I am not sure what happens there. Are the Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, those messianic racist, we call them Michiganers, in the government, whether they are blackmailing Netanyahu or probably is well orchestrated and staged minuet when he asked them to pressure him in order to justify his need to keep the coalition in order to avoid the day of reckoning. He understood, even 8 months or 6 months ago, when there was a proposal for a deal, it always included 3 months of a pause in fighting. But in 3 months, immediately his criminal court case will be resumed. Immediately there will be demands to establish a national inquiry committee. Immediately there will be demands for his resignation. Immediately there will be calls for early election. He doesn't want it because he doesn't know how to stand it. So he prefers to have the war, and that's extremely disturbing. And when you look at what happened with the Bild and Jewish Chronicle, when you look at the details, it's not that it's the first leaks from high echelons in the political or even defense establishment. It's what you see behind it, that the whole manipulation, beyond risking sources of intelligence and the life of soldiers or hostages, it is the Prime Minister and his inner circle are working against rescuing the hostage, against the interest of the book, using bypasses or kind of in order to shape the public opinion in Israel. That's disgusting. It's unheard of. You cannot accept it.
Yeah, I have to ask you, obviously, we talked a lot about, and I think we should say that again, the Ben-Gurion 3 pillars about having a short and aggressive war, having the support of a superpower, and also being morally, sound and just. And this is a week in which we saw the ICC issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu, against Gallant. Obviously, Israel losing legitimacy over what is happening in Gaza. This is one of the results. I do want to hear what you think about that, about those warrants. And are you, as someone who's traveling the world, as a former Israeli prime minister, are you concerned that this at some point might land in your lap?
Look, it's a contemptible decision, very bad one. The essence of what's bad about it, that it draws a moral equivalence between the perpetrators of those unprecedented barbarian attack, probably the worst attack on a Western democracy ever in the last 8 years since World War II. I think that Israel is still a democracy. I'm one of the harshest critiques of Netanyahu. I'm helping the protest movement against him. But Israel is still a democracy, one which fights for its continuation as democracy, but we are still democracy, part of the free world. There is no way that an international legitimate body will draw a line between the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Hamas. And it doesn't mean that we are perfect and we didn't make mistakes. We make mistakes in the execution of our campaign. We make even mistake in fighting these optional arrest warrants, because there were more than one way to show that we stand by the principle of complementarity, mainly that we investigate alone by independent law enforcing agencies.
There is so much we could ask you about, Ehud Barak, and we would love to do that again on Unholy. But for now, thanks so much for...
It's up to Yonit. I cannot stand...
I like the impression that I'm running things. We really appreciate your time. We always feel smarter after talking to you. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you all for having me.
Well, as you said, you inevitably learn a whole lot listening to a man who's been in the room where it's happened so often, and he does have huge, perspective on all of this. I mean, the thing that I think leapt out at both of us was this kind of acceptance of Israel, that Israel will have to almost come to terms with a nuclear Iran. I don't know whether I'd heard that so explicitly when he sort of said almost jokingly, look, we're not going to have to flee the country and go back to, Poland or the Maghreb or whatever. We just may have to suck it up. And that is, for me, I thought quite a striking thought. It's a sign of how far things have gone, that there was a chance, and actually Trump breaking the nuclear deal was a huge acceleration of Iran's nuclear ambitions. But, something Netanyahu thought was a great achievement. Actually, he says, very counterproductive in the country. Iran is basically there, and Israel may just have to accept that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Ehud Barak has become, since 2016, one of the most, if not the most vocal opponent of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think there are many things in which you see that criticism coming out in the conversation, obviously with relation to Gaza, right, saying this should have ended a long time ago. But he is saying we should pray that Trump says, basically, to Netanyahu, end the war. He was optimistic about the Lebanese deal. He said these people, they want to get it done, and it can work. And there's something about not only the strategic thinking and the history, the knowledge of history going back to Ben-Gurion, but also there wasn't anything bitter or pessimistic about the conversation. It's not, look, this is someone who sat in the room 2010, 2011, 2012 and said, let's bomb Iran's nuclear sites. It's not that he is now sitting and saying, okay, if only they listen to me. No, he's saying, look, this is reality. This is what we can do. Iran will never use the bomb against Israel because they're not stupid. I'm paraphrasing what he's saying, but essentially that. And how do we, better improve our strategic situation? But there's no, looking back in a sense of, there's no looking back in anger, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
And somebody at his stage of life, that's notable. Just two small things.
He's 82 years old. I wish, we had that energy now.
Yeah, no, if we get to that stage like that, that's a good thing. Two small things I thought. One, really smart. There's a lot of people think about what Trump's going to do. That sketching of a potential grand bargain and pulling together Russia and Iran, and just as a speaking to the ambition that Donald Trump might have, I think he's insightful on that Trump may want to sort of go big or go home on that. And then a small just observation when he's imagining, and this may only ever be hypothetical, but when he was talking about a future for Gaza and who's allowed to participate in the governance of Gaza, notice he said, that would be prohibited to people who had served in the Hamas military wing. He was imagining a future where potentially people who had been in the Hamas political sort of administration, they may have a role in governing Gaza. Again, I think it's that realism. It's not what he would want to see, but I think just pragmatically, he's thinking somebody's going to have to govern that place afterwards. And he was just a very deliberate choice of words. He was making a distinction there between those people who've, carried arms and those who haven't. So lots in there in that conversation. And he remains a very, compelling figure. Time then for our awards and for chutzpah. And I have a feeling this person not only has been a prolific winner in the past, but he's going to be troubling the judges often in the future as well. Donald Trump is way ahead of the pack for this week's chutzpah award for one of his cabinet appointments. Now, obviously, this has been the gift that keeps on giving, all the cast of characters he's appointed to his cabinet. But we're going to suggest a chutzpah award for one of the more sort of uncontroversial and more, as it were, mainstream appointments, namely his choice to serve as Treasury Secretary of Scott Bessent. The reason why it's a chutzpah is that Donald Trump, really for most of the last decade, has heavily run against and railed against George Soros. Remember, the hate figure of choice for so many people on the nationalist right all over the world. Donald Trump's been right there. He put his face in ads in 2016. He suggested that he was behind the so-called caravan of migrants, which was a big theme during the 2018 midterm elections. He's an anti-Soros guy, yet who has he turned to be his Treasury Secretary? One of George Soros's most trusted lieutenants, for that is Scott Bessent. Bessent was involved in a whole variety of Soros operations over the years, including the one that really brought Soros to global attention, which is when he played a part in what became known as the breaking of the Bank of England in 1992. So amazing to see that one of Team Soros being picked by Donald Trump to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury for such a volte-face, for such a U-turn. Donald Trump gets our chutzpah nomination this week.
As the great American poet Walt Whitman said, I contradict myself, so I contradict myself. But okay, I agree with the chutzpah award of the week. Mensch award. I'm going to give it, you know what? In the spirit of Thanksgiving, I'm giving it to American Jewish actor Paul Rudd, who hosted a screening of the Israeli film, actually the film that Israel sent as a nominee to the Oscars. It's called Come Closer. It's by a young director, Tom Neshel. She is the daughter of legendary Israeli director Avi Neshel. And he hosted this event. So I'm going to give him the Mensch Award for that. Okay? Do that.
So just to clarify, so he's getting Mensch Award. We're praising him for praising an Israeli. That's the thing he's done.
Let me rephrase that. He's cute and he stood up for Israel. Now, that is a diminishing category, sadly. So I think just for that, our standards have, lowered this year.
They have a little bit. I mean, there is something a tiny bit needy about, I mean, I know we've got close to it in recent weeks, but the idea that if you just say something nice about us, we're going to hand you our Mensch Award.
I just want to, and also it's a belated award for Clueless, which is a movie I know you've seen dozens of times.
I have seen it several times.
And it's such a Jewish film, by the way. She's Cher Horowitz. Her father's a lawyer. I'm just saying.
Cher Horowitz gets an award just as one of the great character names. It really does.
And I'm waiting for you to say I totally paused, but you're not going to say that. So we're just going to...
Oh, yeah. Was that it? I totally paused.
No, it's a part.
Now, what's the line?
That's the line. It's fine. I totally paused. Okay, never mind. The point is, this is why I'm not invited to anyone's Thanksgiving, because I just do Clueless from the beginning to the end. Anyway, okay. So you want to suggest an alternative, mensch? Is there a rebellion in the committee?
I think there is one. And funnily enough, in spirit, it's not that far from what you're saying, actually, because the desperation that has come in the era we're now in. But we don't often talk about Uruguay on the podcast. There are Jewish communities all over Latin America. I don't think we talk about them nearly enough. So consider that remedied by me mentioning the newly installed president-elect of Uruguay, Yamandu Orsi, figure of the left. There's quite a group of left-leaning leaders in South America. They're on a sort of winning streak. But this Orsi sort of stands apart because he is not, in that camp who are vehement in their criticism of Israel. Quite the opposite, actually. He was in the country just last year and was expressing admiration for the diversity of Israel. He even went so far, and I thought Biden was the only head of government who ever does this, of self-identifying as a Zionist, use that word. But the thing that's important is that he supports Israel's right to exist, of course, alongside a Palestinian state. And there was a time when to be a two-stater was just the most mainstream boilerplate position for anyone on even centre-right, centre-left. Centre was just the thing you were. It's become rarer to be explicit about that and to be vocal about your support for both and to support for Israel's right to exist and for a Palestinian state to exist. So congratulations, I think, to Yamandu Orsi. Obviously, he'll be mainly celebrating getting a Mensch of the Week nomination, but also president-elect of Uruguay. So a shout out to him.
So just to summarize, I chose a Mensch Award because someone was sympathetic to Israel. You then mocked me and went on to choose a Mensch Award because someone was sympathetic to Israel. Just to summarize this for our listeners. That is what happened this week.
Basically, that's why I said it's in a way uncomfortably close to that. But what's the difference? It's a president, and the other thing was just like an awards thing. So yes, but we're getting slightly close to the bottom of the barrel, both of us. And I'm prepared to put my hands up to that. Now, we've got lots of sort of social media things we need to say, including...
That is allocated to you.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we're already on Instagram and Facebook as Unholy Podcast. We are now on Blue Sky, which I'm sure is where the cool kids now are. We're there as unholypod.bsky.social. So at unholypod.bsky.social. Unholy Podcast is on Blue Sky. I know all the other things as well that are ever so slightly too modern for me. We're on those as well.
The cool kids who want nothing to do with you or me want to remind us also that we are on YouTube. I think that's also important to say. You can also see us, not only hear us, if you'd like to. And we are winding up our conversation for the week. We will say our big thank yous to Michal Porat and to Gili Remen. And we, I think, shall meet next week.
We will.